They thought the battlefield was silent. German generals, masters of precision and movement, believed that victory came from control, from order, maps, and steel. To them, war was a matter of sight and timing. What you could see, you could destroy. What you couldn't see didn't exist. But the Americans were fighting a different kind of war. One you couldn't see, one you could only hear. In secret labs buried under hills and coastal bases shrouded in fog, scientists were building machines that could detect what eyes never could: the heartbeat of engines miles away, the pulse of airplanes in the dark, even the footsteps of soldiers crossing frozen ground. They wired the battlefield for sound. From radar towers in Britain to sonar stations in the Atlantic, from microphones hidden in the forests of France to listening posts on Pacific islands, America was no longer fighting with just guns. They were fighting with awareness. And as the Germans marched into the quiet night, convinced of their stealth, they never realized the silence they trusted was already listening. In the early years of the war, the Germans ruled the battlefield with precision. Their tanks struck with perfect timing. Their bombers appeared like clockwork. Their generals believed that war was mathematics, angles, maps, and fuel. They trusted silence. If the enemy couldn't see you, you were safe. But America was learning that silence could be deceiving. In 1940, a handful of scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology began building something that would change the nature of war forever. They called it the invisible eye. The world would come to know it as radar. While German commanders moved their divisions in secret, the Americans were turning the air itself into a canvas of light and sound. Waves of radio energy, invisible and constant, swept across oceans and skies. They bounced off steel and returned as echoes, whispers that revealed everything silence tried to hide. By the time the US entered the war, the quiet spaces the Germans trusted most were already filled with American signals. In the bunkers of England, radar stations watched the channel day and night. Their operators, young men and women barely out of school, sat before glowing green screens, tracing the blips of aircraft that hadn't even appeared yet. Each dot wasn't just a plane, it was a warning. Each echo wasn't just sound, it was information. When the German Luftwaffe launched raids on London, British radar arrays spotted them over the French coast. By the time the bombers crossed the Channel, Spitfires were already waiting in the clouds. Hitler's pilots called it witchcraft. It wasn't. It was math turned into awareness. And America was listening. They sent engineers, scientists, and naval officers to study Britain's secret, and when they returned, they didn't just copy it. They amplified it. In fields across New Jersey and Rhode Island, radar towers rose overnight. On destroyers and carriers, rotating antennas scanned the dark, humming with low mechanical rhythm. Even deep in the Pacific, isolated islands became listening posts. The United States wasn't just seeing the war, it was hearing it, predicting it, feeling it. By 1943, American engineers had merged radar with sound microphones buried in snow, buoys floating in the ocean, even aircraft fitted with acoustic sensors that could pinpoint movement through fog and rain. Every hum, every tremor, every vibration was a clue. To the Germans, it was impossible. How could an enemy fight what he couldn't see? How could machines hear through storms? But they didn't understand the Americans weren't just building weapons. They were building perception. From radar rooms to submarines, the US military had created a new dimension of warfare, one where silence no longer existed. Every machine, every step, every whisper left an echo, and the Americans were listening to all of it. By the end of 1943, German generals began to notice something strange. Convoys that should have been ambushed vanished before contact. Aircraft formations broke apart before the Luftwaffe could intercept. Every move they made, every secret offensive, every deployment seemed to be met by an invisible counter. They didn't know it yet, but the silence they trusted had been turned into their loudest enemy. By 1944, war had gone invisible. The German High Command still thought in maps and arrows, divisions moving across paper, supply lines running through forests, radio operators whispering coordinates. They believed the battlefield was quiet until the first shot was fired. But for the Allies, the battle had already begun hours, sometimes days earlier, because the Americans had wired the world for sound. Every plane, every ship, every movement made a noise, a vibration, a frequency, a whisper in the air. And somewhere, someone was listening. In the concrete bunkers of southern England, radar stations hummed like living machines. Screens glowed green in the dark, tracing hundreds of tiny blips that danced across the channel. Operators leaned in, speaking into microphones with calm precision. Contact detected. Bearing 142. Multiple targets. Altitude increasing. The dots were German bombers. But long before they reached the coast, American and British controllers had already calculated their flight paths, interception angles, and exit routes. By the time the Luftwaffe crossed the sea, the traps were already set. To the German pilots, it felt like the sky itself had turned against them. They couldn't hide. Clouds didn't help. Night didn't protect them. Because the Americans weren't fighting what they could see, they were fighting what they could hear. While radar ruled the skies, microphones ruled the ground. In the forests of France, small metal boxes buried beneath leaves recorded the faint rumble of German engines miles away. Each sensor sent signals through hidden cables to Allied listening posts. Operators could tell not just that tanks were coming, but what kind of tanks. A Panther made a lower hum. A Tiger rattled deeper. Trucks and infantry had lighter, uneven rhythms. It was science mixed with instinct. The battlefield had become a heartbeat, and the Allies could feel every pulse. On the Western Front, German commanders began to notice something uncanny. Every time they regrouped their armor for a counterattack, Allied artillery would strike before they even moved. It was as if someone was watching them from the clouds, but reconnaissance planes hadn't flown in days. They didn't know that the sound of their tanks' starting engines had already given them away. To a soldier, silence is safety, but to a scientist, silence is data. In the Atlantic, the Americans had extended this invisible empire even further. Sonar arrays stretched across the ocean, turning sound into vision. Every propeller left a distinct signature, a rhythm in the deep that could be traced for miles. The Germans once believed their U-boats were undetectable. Now, even their silence was being recorded. The Allies had learned that the ocean was never truly quiet. It was alive with echoes, and within those echoes, they could find everything. One sonar operator aboard the destroyer USS England wrote in his logbook, "We don't look for submarines anymore. We wait for them to speak." By the summer of 1944, the U-boat fleet that once terrorized the Atlantic was collapsing under invisible pressure. Each sonar ping that echoed across the waves was a sentence, a signal that the hunter had become the hunted. And then came Normandy. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, was not guided by sight, but by sound. In the weeks before D-Day, Allied engineers created a web of acoustic deception. Fake engines roared miles from real staging areas. Recorded tank noises played through giant speakers in fields of England, fooling German scouts into thinking the invasion would strike Calais instead of Normandy. The Germans heard what they expected to hear. The Allies let them. When the real invasion began, radar kept the skies clear, sonar kept the seas secure, and microphones buried in the cliffs of France relayed German movements in real time. Every ship, every plane, every tank was part of one connected rhythm, a symphony of war conducted through sound. In Berlin, German officers tried to explain the impossible. How did the Allies know where every unit was? How did they anticipate every strike? How could silence betray them? They blamed spies. They blamed betrayal. They even blamed witchcraft. But the truth was colder and smarter. The Allies had learned to weaponize information itself. The battlefield wasn't silent anymore. It was alive. Every step, every hum, every signal translated, recorded, and used against the men who believed silence was protection. And for the first time, the German war machine realized it was surrounded by something it couldn't see, couldn't shoot, and couldn't escape: sound. By the summer of 1944, the battlefield no longer belonged to generals with maps, it belonged to listeners with headsets. From the beaches of Normandy to the hedgerows of France, the Allies had built something that no army in history had ever possessed: a sound grid. Every movement, every order, every heartbeat of the German war machine echoed through that grid. The Americans didn't just fight battles, they heard them before they began. In an underground bunker near Portsmouth, England, an operations officer leaned over a table glowing with radio signals. Lines of light traced across a large map of France. Sound signatures relayed from microphones, radar towers, and reconnaissance planes. Each line pulsed like veins in a living creature. The battlefield was alive, and America was its nervous system. He pointed to a cluster near Caen. "Enemy armor mobilizing," he said calmly. A radio operator nodded, transmitting coordinates. Miles away, Allied artillery adjusted their aim before the tanks even started their engines. Minutes later, the night sky over Caen erupted in orange. The Germans never knew how the Allies found them. They thought it was coincidence. It wasn't. It was sound. By August, the Americans had turned this technology into routine. Convoys crossing France moved under constant radar cover, their positions tracked and updated through coded frequencies. Artillery batteries received acoustic triangulation data within minutes, sound waves, pinpointing enemy gunfire to exact coordinates. The Germans fired from behind hills, confident they were hidden. 2 minutes later, counter-battery shells landed directly on their position. To the German officers, it felt like black magic. To the Americans, it was geometry. They had learned to see through sound. In the ruined towns of northern France, engineers set up portable listening posts, microphones disguised as debris, connected by thin copper wires running through cellars and trenches. These acoustic nets captured the clatter of movement in occupied zones. Trucks, tanks, even marching boots all became signals. At night, operators huddled around amplifiers, adjusting dials until the noise sharpened into rhythm. 2 vehicles, heavy, moving south. Copy that. Possible armor column. The reports climbed the chain of command in minutes. By dawn, Allied bombers were already overhead. The Germans never saw them coming, but the microphones had. Meanwhile, in Berlin, panic was spreading quietly. German generals began to realize their reports were being anticipated. Their attacks were countered almost instantly. Even their retreats were ambushed before they began. At OKW headquarters, one officer slammed his fist on the table. "Someone is listening to us," he growled. Another replied bitterly, "No, Herr General, everyone is listening to us." But the real fear came when they discovered something worse. Even when they weren't speaking, the enemy still knew. The Allies had reached a level of awareness the Germans couldn't comprehend, a war fought not by sight or orders, but by perception. In September 1944, as the Allies pushed toward the Rhine, sound intelligence became unstoppable. Planes fitted with radar scanned the night sky for enemy bombers, guiding interceptors in perfect darkness. Under the earth, seismic microphones detected the rumble of troop trains hundreds of miles away. And in the airwaves, new devices called SCR-584 radar systems could track a single artillery shell mid-flight, redirecting fire with mathematical precision. War had become information, and information had become a weapon. For the Germans, this transformation was unbearable. They had built a war on domination, on control, movement, and speed. Now, every step they took was echoed, recorded, and used against them. Even whispers inside bunkers were no longer safe. Allied agents had planted microphones in the walls of occupied buildings. When German officers gathered for strategy meetings, their own words traveled through hidden wires to listening trucks miles away. One intercepted recording from late 1944 captured a frustrated commander shouting, "They know everything! Before we even finish speaking, they are already answering." He wasn't exaggerating. By then, the American sound network had evolved into an early form of electronic warfare, intercepting, decoding, and jamming signals in real time. The Germans' radios became their own betrayers. In the chaos of retreat, one young German officer wrote in his field diary, "We are fighting ghosts. They never appear, yet they always know where we are. It is as if the wind itself reports our position." He didn't know that he was right in a way. The wind, the rain, the echoes of footsteps, the hum of engines, it was all being translated into coordinates by the machines of sound. The Germans were still fighting the war they could see. The Americans were fighting the one they could hear. By winter, it was clear who would win. The silent battlefield Germany trusted no longer existed. Every whisper had become an alarm. Every quiet valley, a microphone. Every movement, an echo waiting to betray them. And as their maps shrank and their armies fell back toward the Rhine, the generals realized the cruelest irony of all. The quietest enemy they had ever faced was the one that never stopped listening. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing, but for the men inside the bunkers of Berlin, It didn't feel like defeat. It felt like disorientation. The maps still showed cities. The radios still worked. But somewhere between the orders and the outcomes, the world had gone quiet. Convoys went missing. Airfields were bombed minutes after new planes arrived. Rail lines were destroyed before trains could even unload. The Germans didn't know how. They still believed they had secrecy. They didn't realize that every whisper, every engine, every coded message was already being heard. At Allied headquarters in London, the invisible orchestra of sound intelligence was playing its final, perfect note. Radar stations tracked everything in the sky. Microphones buried along the French and Belgian borders picked up the rumble of German armor still fighting to hold the line. In the Atlantic, sonar networks heard the last U-boats slipping toward Norway. And in the air, American bombers received real-time updates mid-flight guided by radar reflections bouncing off the very cities they were about to strike. It wasn't just coordination anymore. It was omniscience. The Allies weren't reacting to the war. They were predicting it. In one secret facility, Station X, a group of analysts monitored sound transmissions pouring in from across Europe. One operator marked a sudden spike in static near the German border. "Ground movement, hundreds of vehicles," she said. Her superior leaned over her shoulder. "Direction? East." He smiled faintly. "They're retreating." Within hours, Allied ground forces moved to intercept. When the German convoy arrived at what they thought was safety, artillery already had them zeroed in. It wasn't luck. It wasn't espionage. It was physics. Every tire that turned, every truck that shifted weight on frozen ground, the vibrations were recorded, triangulated, and transmitted. Inside Berlin, the last German generals gathered in their command bunker. Their radios crackled with chaos-broken reports, missing battalions, silence from the front. They demanded answers. No one had any. A young signal officer hesitated, then said softly, "Sir, it's as if they can hear us." The room went silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then an older general muttered, "They've wired the world." Meanwhile, across the Rhine, American engineers were finishing the next stage of this invisible empire sound mapping. Microphones, radars, and seismographs connected through a single grid, feeding data into primitive computers. It was the first battlefield network in history. To the men watching it, the effect was chilling. Dots appeared on the screen where German units were moving. Before the enemy could cross a bridge, Allied forces had already marked the coordinates. Before a train reached a junction, bombers were already in the air. It wasn't war, it was orchestration. The Germans still believed that silence was protection. They didn't realize that silence itself made noise. In empty valleys, microphones picked up faint echoes from artillery far away. The reflections gave away their position. In the ruins of cities, radar waves bounced off metal roofs, mapping troop locations through debris. Even their radio silence told a story when a station stopped transmitting. The Allies knew it was either destroyed or relocated, and they could follow the absence like a trail. The quieter Germany became, the clearer the picture grew. By April, the sound of war had turned into one continuous hum: radar, sonar, engines, voices, echoes, and static all blending into a single, endless frequency. One American analyst wrote in his logbook, "The enemy has vanished, but the noise remains." That noise was victory, the confirmation that everything Germany had built on secrecy and stealth had been dismantled by awareness. The Third Reich, which began with speeches shouted through microphones, was now dying in a world that belonged to listeners. On April 30th, when Hitler took his final breath inside the Führerbunker, the city above was vibrating with sound. Artillery thundered in the distance. Allied planes roared overhead, and in hidden Allied stations miles away, those vibrations were still being measured, logged, and analyzed, the final echoes of a regime that had once ruled through noise and fear. The last German radio message ever sent from Berlin read, "To all stations, we are surrounded." It wasn't just a message, it was a confession. The war had ended the way it had been fought, not with sight, not with fire, but with sound. When Berlin finally fell, Allied engineers walked through the ruins of the city with portable microphones and recorders capturing the sounds of a world reborn. The creak of collapsing steel, the drip of water through concrete, the silence between artillery strikes. One technician wrote later, "Even after it was over, the air still buzzed. You could feel the memory of sound in the ground itself. And so, the world that emerged from the ashes of 1945 was not silent. It was wired. Every nation understood the new rule. You can hide your army, you can disguise your tanks, but you can never silence the air, because the battlefield once ruled by sight now belonged to those who could listen. The guns went silent in May 1945, but the air did not. In every corner of the shattered world, the hum of machines still echoed. Radar dishes spinning, radio towers pulsing, microphones clicking in the static. War had ended, but the sound of it lingered, like an afterimage burned into the sky. For the men who had built America's invisible empire, victory felt strange. There were no parades for them, no medals, only silence, the very thing they had spent the war defeating. They called themselves the listeners, engineers, operators, mathematicians, physicists, men and women who never fired a bullet but changed every battle. They had learned something terrifying and beautiful. If you can hear everything, you can predict anything. In the months after the surrender, the Allies gathered in London to study the data, thousands of hours of sound logs, radar reports, and intercepted signals. Every echo was catalogued, every pattern analysed. One report from the Office of Naval Research began with a single line: "The future of war lies in awareness." And that future had already begun. The American military, once known for its muscle, was now known for its mind. Radar became the blueprint for early computers. Sonar inspired underwater communication networks. The machines that had heard German tanks in the night were now mapping the seafloor, tracking storms, and guiding aircraft across the globe. The war for sound had ended, but the age of information had just begun. In Germany, silence took on a different meaning. The surviving generals sat in cold interrogation rooms, listening to recordings of their own commands, intercepted, decoded, and archived by their enemies. They realized for the first time that their downfall hadn't come from betrayal, but from ignorance. They had trusted silence, and silence had betrayed them. One captured officer was shown a transcript of a conversation he'd had months earlier, words spoken in a bunker hundreds of miles from the front, now printed neatly in English. He stared at the paper for a long time before whispering, "You were always there, weren't you?" The American interrogator didn't answer. He just nodded. For the scientists who had made it possible, there was no celebration, only reflection. They had proven that awareness could win wars, but they also understood what that meant for the world to come. If sound could expose armies, what could it do to nations? If the air itself could be weaponized, what would peace even sound like? In 1946, as Europe rebuilt, the same American engineers began laying underwater cables, turning wartime sonar into peacetime communication. Messages that once guided destroyers now carried voices across continents. The same frequencies that once hunted U-boats were now used to connect humanity. The instruments of war had become the infrastructure of civilization, and yet, for those who had lived through it, the memories remained alive. In the Naval Archives of Washington, there exists a recording, faint, distorted, preserved on magnetic tape. It's the last sonar ping from the Battle of the Atlantic. A long pause, then silence. Engineers labeled it simply, "End of contact." But when the operator who recorded it played it back years later, he claimed he could still hear something faint beneath the silence, a low hum, like a heartbeat, echoing through the static. "Maybe it's just the ocean," he said. Or maybe the war never really stopped. By 1947, the technology that once filled basements and bunkers had moved into the skies. Early warning radar systems stretched across the Arctic. The Atlantic, once the graveyard of ships, had become a wall of sound, a living barrier capable of hearing everything from submarines to storms. The network the Americans had built to defeat Germany now listened to the entire world, and the irony was perfect. The same silence that had destroyed the Reich was now protecting the planet from itself. But deep inside research labs, the next generation of scientists remembered the lesson of 1943. Silence is never empty. It's data waiting to be heard. In the ruins of Berlin, among the debris of microphones, broken radios, and gutted control rooms, Allied engineers found something haunting: German research notes on passive listening devices. The Reich had been working on its own version of radar, months away from breakthrough when the war ended. They had been close, terrifyingly close, But close wasn't enough. Sound moves faster than ambition, and while Hitler's engineers designed their next miracle weapon, the Americans had already built a weapon that couldn't be bombed, burned, or buried. A weapon made of airwaves, a weapon made of understanding. One historian later said, World War II began with men shouting into microphones and ended with the microphones shouting back. That was the truth of it. The generals who once mocked American radios died not knowing that those same radios had evolved into a network that spanned the earth. The battlefield had been wired, and it would never go quiet again. Every modern radar, every surveillance satellite, every data link, all of them trace their lineage back to that war of echoes, to the moment when the air itself became a weapon. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear it, the hum of radar spinning somewhere over an empty ocean, the soft ping of sonar deep below, the heartbeat of a world that learned to listen. Because in 1945, when the guns fell silent, the sound never really stopped. By the time the world entered the Cold War, one truth had become clear. The war that had been fought with tanks, bombs, and blood was no longer the future of warfare. The future was made of signals, frequencies, and the invisible web of data. The legacy of World War II wasn't just in the rubble of cities or the remains of armies. It was in the air itself. The battlefield had been rewired, and the world that followed would never look the same. In the years after the war, Allied engineers and military strategists began to refine the technology that had given them victory. Sonar, radar, and cryptography. These were no longer secret weapons. They were infrastructure. The U.S. Navy launched the Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS, a vast underwater network that could track Soviet submarines in real time. The very same sonar systems that had hunted U-boats now patrolled the oceans, listening for the hum of enemy propellers and the soft whine of nuclear submarines. America's advantage wasn't just in the missiles and bombs it held, it was in the ability to hear everything, everywhere. And this invisible empire of sound expanded. In the air, the radar technology that had guided bombers across Europe now guided entire fleets of surveillance planes. The U.S. Air Force set up a network of radar systems that spanned the globe, turning every inch of Earth into an open book. American bombers could track their enemies, but more importantly, they could track each other. One radar wave could coordinate dozens of planes, each with pinpoint precision. What had begun as a way to predict enemy movements in Europe now became a global network, connecting the skies. The Cold War wasn't fought with weapons alone, it was fought with awareness. The sound that once hunted German tanks and U-boats had now evolved into the heartbeat of a new geopolitical struggle. Meanwhile, on land, the legacy of sound warfare continued to grow. During the 1,950 seconds, as tensions with the Soviet Union rose, the U.S. military established new surveillance technologies designed to track enemy troops from miles away. Acoustic sensors and seismic microphones were planted along borders, listening posts that picked up the vibration of a single tank or the footsteps of soldiers marching. The military had learned an invaluable lesson. Knowing where the enemy was, before they even arrived, was the true advantage. One Pentagon report from 1957 stated, "The battlefield of the future will be silent, and in that silence, we will hear everything." The Cold War wasn't just a battle of missiles and ideology, it was a war of perception, where the side that could hear everything, even the smallest sound, would control the future. But it wasn't just the military that was transformed by the legacy of sound. The rise of information technology and communications in the post-war world was directly influenced by the wartime innovations of radar and sonar. Computers designed to track enemy movements evolved into the very first digital systems. The very first personal computers, like the ENIAC, were built with wartime principles in mind, calculating trajectories, decoding enemy communications, and processing data faster than ever before. It was a paradigm shift. The concept of communication was no longer limited to sending messages or orders. It had become the ability to track, predict, and act before anything had even happened. And from that came the modern world of real-time communications, the internet, and digital surveillance. Everything connected by a single thread, sound. In Berlin, as the city healed and rebuilt, echoes of the past remained. The sounds of war had turned into the sounds of surveillance. The remnants of Hitler's empire lay silent, but the Allies had learned too much from their victory. One former German scientist, speaking decades later, admitted, "We thought the war was about machines, but the real weapon was listening. It wasn't just tanks or aircraft that had won the war. It was the invisible network of sound that stretched from Europe to the Pacific, from the skies to the oceans, connecting everything. The Germans had believed their silence was their shield, but the Americans had learned to weaponize silence itself. In the decades following, the technologies developed during the war not only shaped military strategies but also influenced global intelligence operations. The CIA, the NSA, and other intelligence agencies used the lessons learned from World War II to build surveillance networks that would later define the 20th century. Sound, once a weapon of war, had become a tool of peace, or at least of control. The power of radar, sonar, and interception grew exponentially, leading to the rise of global surveillance systems capable of tracking communications across entire continents. The Cold War was fought as much in the shadows as on the front lines, a battle of invisible webs where every signal could be intercepted, decoded, and used against you. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the world had completely transformed. The battlefield wasn't just a place, it was a network, and the ability to hear, to intercept, to understand it had become the ultimate weapon. The sound of war had gone quiet, but the legacy of listening was still alive. In every corner of the world, in every corner of every government agency, the knowledge of how to hear everything would remain, because once you hear everything, you control everything.